And as we come on the air, we are following the very latest as it relates to President Donald Trump. I want to take you out to Washington, D.C. and give you a live look at the White House on this Wednesday morning. We are following breaking news as U.S. President Donald Trump's reciprocal tariffs on dozens of countries took effect today. This includes a massive 104% duty on Chinese goods. Of course, this is deepening his global trade war and spurring more widespread selling across financial markets. A lot to discuss, so we want to bring into the conversation the expert, Rajiv Sawhney, head of international portfolio management. Rajiv, good morning to you. A pleasure having you join us here on Live Now from Fox. So if you could set the stage for us this morning as we are following the very latest, a lot to discuss. And the first question, what are these tariffs and how are these tariffs impacting the everyday American?
Yeah, these tariffs really are on exporting goods from China, right? I think the distinction here is really the trade imbalance that has persisted for several decades with China. Trump has made it as part of his campaign plan that he wanted to put these tariffs in. He was willing to sort of go down on and sort of, double down with China in terms of sort of the tit for tat. And then so I think the markets, obviously, the tariffs are quite high. 100% is quite a meaningful increase in tariffs. But on net aggregate, I think the markets were expecting that Trump to sort of martingale and sort of double down on this. The problem is that how long does this continue to keep going, right? Because it seems that China on the same side is also ramping up in terms of their tariffs and other sort of trade initiatives on their side as well. Yeah.
Rajiv, and speaking of China, we have the very latest this morning as China is responding after these U.S. tariffs take effect. Again, providing this perspective, this is a new 104% rate on China. We have a quote from the Ministry of Commerce this Wednesday morning. It says the U.S. threat to escalate tariffs on China is a mistake on top of a mistake and once again exposes the blackmailing nature of the U.S. China will never accept this. If the U.S. insists on its own way, China will fight to the end. Provide perspective on this quote, please, Rajiv, and what does this mean for trade with a top world leader?
Yeah, I think, this is obviously, it's not out of line from sort of the Chinese government. They've been basically a very hard stance in terms of projecting a strong image. Other countries like Vietnam, they quickly came back and said, look, we're going to take off all our tariffs and write them to zero. So it definitely shows sort of the hand of certain nations that think they have a sort of economic edge or trade and edge in the midst of this sort of world trade war, right? And so I'm not surprised by this announcement. And, I think really it's going to be digging into the details of what they actually decide to do, right?
U.S. President Donald Trump has obviously said that this decision is reciprocity. It's reciprocal. So maybe potentially he could walk back on this decision if China makes a decision on their end. Provide that perspective and what that means. Obviously, people go to the store every day. They look on a tag and it might say made in China. There are concerns this morning that the price of goods and services will skyrocket.
Yeah, I think for the everyday American, really remains to be seen. I expect a lot of the sort of suppliers to sort of warehouse some of that if they think that this is going to be the China and U.S. will be able to come to terms and find some sort of short-term resolution. Obviously, they don't want to, push this back onto consumers that are already, struggling in terms of inflation and sort of, all the indicators that in the U.S. of sort of a drag or stagflation. And so I think, eventually I think something will have to give, right? We can't keep doing this brinkmanship between China and the U.S. because more or less both need each other, right? You can't undo 5 decades of sort of supply chain within a week, right? And so your everyday iPhone or your electronic goods or even your clothing, right? A large portion of that comes from China. And China, they've been in a deflationary environment or economy for several years now, right? And so they've been trying to export out of this deflation by producing more and more goods. So they need us as much as we need them.
Rajiv, as we've been following this news, many economic terms have been coming to the forefront, including the global market. When we look at the Dow, we've been seeing the New York Stock Exchange open in the red many days this week, and it's only Wednesday. How does this impact trade as far as the global market? How does it impact people who have stocks that are concerned about that as well?
Yeah, I definitely think that the immediate reaction was from the market to go down, right? A lot of these exporter companies or companies that are reliant on China had a meaningful drawdown in the market. Obviously chip makers, from sort of Nvidia, et cetera, are going to potentially be impacted by this. And so obviously the markets are reacting to this. And so we're mindful of that. Ultimately, though, we want to see where the equilibrium happens, right? And we haven't really seen a lot from sort of the Fed. Obviously, Powell made some comments last week. We're watching, for example, treasuries, right? And we're seeing sort of a meaningful uptick in treasuries over the last 24 hours, right? A lot of that we think is coming from sort of traditional hedge funds and sort of institutions unwinding classic basis trades. But if that continues to kick higher, if we see the 10-year, touching above sort of 4.5 and continuing to remain there, then yes, I think, we have to be mindful that this is more of a contagion, not from necessarily the US, but it's going into other asset products like treasuries or gold, et cetera. So we're mindful of how this all is interconnected and watching very closely.
Rajiv, and as you discussed that, taking you and the viewers out to Germany, giving you all a live look as the Frankfurt Stock Exchange opens this Wednesday, as President Donald Trump's reciprocal tariffs do take effect. As we continue to follow this breaking news, what advice or maybe remarks would you share with the viewers who are concerned about their stocks, who are concerned about maybe being able to afford everyday goods and services? Maybe they're concerned about the price of gas going up because of this.
Yeah, I think you definitely, we're long-term investors and we always have a long-term view in the market, right? And, we had this in COVID where we had the drawdown in COVID in March and sort of the market responded and was able to recover. And I think you always have to take a long-term view of the markets. And from our perspective, if the markets are efficient, they'll find a way and they'll find a solution and things will recover, right? And so for our business, we're really looking at the long-term play. And so for your viewers at home, it's really, if you're in the markets, if you're looking for a long-term sort of investment, to be mindful that historically, the equities have done really well in the U.S. and sort of, investments should over time recover. And then for, the everyday consumer, yeah, we have to be nimble and maybe we have to be mindful in terms of what the pricing. But I expect that most of the suppliers and sort of the companies that are importers of sort of Chinese goods will try to warehouse this and try to mitigate this as long as possible, with the expectation that the administration can come to resolution with China.
Rajiv Sawhney, thank you so much for joining us bright and early with this detailed breakdown and overview on this breaking news alert. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Likewise. Thank you, Janae. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And as we further discuss this news, taking you back out to the very latest response from the Ministry of Commerce this Wednesday morning as China responds after U.S. tariffs take effect. Again, they say, quote, the U.S. threat to escalate tariffs on China is a mistake on top of a mistake and once again exposes the blackmailing nature of the U.S. China will never accept this. If the U.S. insists on its own way, China will fight to the end.